Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Special coverage of Governor Brad Little's 2025 State of the State address. We are waiting for him to get started. Joining me for live analysis of the speech after is Kevin Richard of Idaho Education News, Lori Wolf, Director of the Division of Financial Management, and Dr. Stephanie Witt of Boise State University School of Public Service. Kevin, as we're waiting for the governor to get started, what are you going to be listening for?
Well, on the education front, there are a lot of things that we can be listening for in terms of funding, in terms of the future of the Idaho Launch Program, but also the debate about private school choice and what form that might take and where the governor may come down on that.
Dr. Witt, what are you going to be listening for in the highlights?
Well, this is a chance for the governor to signal to the legislature what he hopes to see happening. And so I'm interested to see what are the high points.
Lori, you're relatively new to the Division of Financial Management. Can you give us a preview of what we might be hearing from the governor?
Yeah, well, you're going to see the same thing you've seen from the governor over and over again, meeting some of his commitments. It's going to be a conservative budget. It's going to be structurally balanced.
I'm going to cut you off there. The governor is about to get started. Let's listen in.
Appreciate that. Mr. Speaker, Mr. Pro Tem, Mr. President, honored legislators, my fellow constitutional officers, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the judiciary, my wife Teresa and our family, wave you guys, my friends and my fellow Idahoans. Just 2 months ago, on the eve of a historic presidential election, America teetered between two very different futures for the next 4 years and beyond. One future guaranteed the status quo, out of control federal spending, a lawless open border, sky-high inflation, onerous regulations, and a depressed economy that traps families' potential. Americans rejected that failed path and instead re-elected a man with a very different vision for America, Donald Trump. President Trump's vision for America actually looks a lot like Idaho. With their votes, Americans affirmed what we want for our country and what Idaho has: safe communities, bustling economic activity, increased incomes, tax relief, fewer regulations, fiscal responsibility, and common sense values. I'm excited about President Trump's return to the White House. We have a renewed opportunity to help him deliver results and show the rest of the country how to do things right. And that starts with keeping promises. Idaho's elected leaders have promised and delivered real results over and over and over for the people we serve. I want to congratulate all our legislators on their elections and recognize the new members of leadership of both parties. As a former legislator and member of Senate leadership, I understand the challenges and the rewards of bringing everybody together. I commit to all my legislative partners that we will work productively together this legislative session. Together, we promised Idahoans historic tax relief and delivered back-to-back-to-back tax cuts for Idaho families and businesses. We delivered property tax cuts and a new lower flat income tax. We increased the grocery tax rebate, and we stand ready to implement President Trump's promised tax cuts. And my Keeping Promises plan continues the trend. I'm proposing yet another round of tax relief for hardworking Idaho families. $100 million. On top of the $4.6 billion we have already given back to Idahoans over the past 5 years. We also promised to deliver unprecedented investments in schools, the American worker, water, roads, fire, outdoor recreation, and other infrastructure without raising taxes. My Keeping Promises plan builds on those investments by more support for schools. On top of the 80% increase in state funding we championed for education since I took office. Idaho offers an abundance of schooling options for each student's unique needs. We lead the nation in expanding and supporting public charter schools. I was proud to receive the National Charter School Champion Award on behalf of our state after we cut red tape and added more support and flexibility just last year. Public charter schools are unquestionably popular in our state, serving about 30,000 students, up 30% from just 5 years ago. I support charter schools because they offer families more options for their children's education while providing taxpayers the accountability and transparency they deserve. We are also one of the few states that enable parents to choose the best school for their children, regardless of where they live. And our popular Empowering Parents program offers grants to support students' education outside of the classroom. We are a leader in education freedom. I recognize the growing desire to expand school choice, especially for students with unique physical or developmental conditions. I am recommending $50 million to further expand education options for Idaho families. Just like we do with every taxpayer dollar that is spent in government, we will ensure there is oversight in school choice. Why? Because accountability in government is an Idaho value. It is what taxpayers demand and deserve. As we expect the following from our public schools, any school choice measure I would consider must be done the Idaho way. That means it is fair, responsible, transparent, and accountable. It must prioritize the families that need it most, and it must not take away funds from public schools. We will do so while continuing to prioritize first and foremost our public schools. Adequately funding public schools is both our constitutional and our moral obligation, and we will not abandon that obligation. We have significantly increased teacher pay and health benefits, increased funding for literacy, and began to address the long-standing facilities needs in schools all across Idaho. However, even with the historic investments over the past 5 years, there are still known gaps. My Keeping Promises plan includes over $150 million for public schools. I look forward to working with the legislature to address gaps in rural school facilities, mental health, school safety, and literacy. We also must embrace accountability in public schools to guarantee the best outcomes for our students. Together, we will ensure the best education in Idaho is in a public school. We have also kept our promises to Idahoans by standing up for common sense values. Idaho was the first state to take action to defend women's sports. I'm incredibly proud of Boise State University's women's volleyball team for standing up for what's right. thought that would get Barb up anyway. Generations have worked hard to guarantee our girls and women can play fair and square. To our female athletes, we will continue to fight for you. While we're on the topic of fairness in women's sports, I'm disappointed to acknowledge voter fraud does exist. An election was stolen. And I'm asking Speaker Mike Moyle, Pro Tem Kelly Anthony, to launch an investigation into the flawed voting on the Heisman Trophy. McGrain was really nervous about that part. Reflecting on the past year, two natural elements consumed Idaho's attention: water and fire. Our farmers confronted a real problem head-on: long-term decline in water in the aquifer that sustains Idaho agriculture. Our farmers worked hard to secure a new water deal that safeguards Idaho's water and sovereignty. Friends, let's thank our farmers. Along with our citizen legislators and Lieutenant Governor Scott Bedke, they crafted a new plan that maintains control of our water destiny. Not other states, not the feds, not men and women in robes, no offense to my esteemed judges. My Keeping Promises plan helps tackle the backlog of unfunded water projects, because securing water for future generations and protecting Idaho agriculture requires both the new plan and continuing investments that have proven to raise the water levels in the Eastern State Plain Aquifer, the lifeblood of Idaho agriculture. On the heels of a destructive fire season, our Keeping Promises plan also deploys additional bonuses to hire and retain wildland firefighters. Our firefighters battle dangerous conditions to protect lives, property, and our natural resources. Please recognize a few of these tough Idahoans we have with us today. Right up there. Stand up. I'm also asking the legislature to properly fund the fire suppression account so these firefighters know that we've got their back. Last summer, I called out the feds for not putting out fires more aggressively. The state of Idaho leads on fire and forest management where the feds have failed. Idahoans are tired of choking on smoke for weeks on end. I look forward to working with the Trump administration to boldly transform how wildfire in our western lands are managed. How else are we keeping our promises to Idahoans? With more people traveling Idaho's highways than ever before, we have responsibly championed historic transportation investments to keep up with record growth without raising taxes. Our Keeping Promises plan keeps our foot on the gas with additional transportation funding. We will continue to improve our existing roads and bridges and get people and products across our state safely and efficiently. Speaking of growth, I've identified the source of Idaho's population boom: cows. Former residents of California, Oregon, and Washington. Last year, I told you we would build a wall around Idaho and make California pay for it. This year, I think a cattle guard would be more effective at keeping out the cows. For your city folks, that's some Emmett Rancher stuff I'll explain later. It's true we are victims of our own success. Growth does indeed come with many opportunities, but it also comes with challenges. The cost of owning a home is just too expensive for too many Idaho families. You've all heard me state my goal from day one, to make Idaho the place where our children and grandchildren choose to stay for the ones that left to choose to return. It's difficult to achieve that goal when home ownership is so far out of reach. We are feeling the pinch in the housing supply. I look forward to working with legislators to remove even more regulatory barriers and further advance needed permitting reforms in order to keep up with housing demand. In 2022, this body put a record amount into workforce housing, creating thousands of homes for Idaho families. And our Keeping Promises plans will help build even more homes so more working families can achieve the American dream. We also need skilled labor to keep up with the pace of development. Our efforts to get more Idaho kids in the trades is helping. Across the country, the number of students on track to a career is declining, but not in Idaho. Idaho's bucking the trend. Thanks to Launch, we have the largest cohort ever of students enrolling in an education or training program after high school. 2/3 of students who went on to an Idaho school last year used a Launch grant. Community college attendance is surging, 15%. Those are real results. Launch convinced kids who never would have considered training after high school to go on. Many of these students will support the industries that help us keep up with growth: jobs in construction, auto technicians, plumbers, welders, electricians, and a host of other professions. My Keeping Promises plan increases capacity for working-class Idahoans to get a fast track to a career. There is one major takeaway from the historic presidential election 2 months ago. The working people of America want someone fighting for them. President Trump himself said, quote, "We must embrace new and effective job training approaches." Mr. President, we will welcome the opportunity to work with you to structure innovative, effective workforce training programs like Idaho's Launch all across the nation. There is no doubt Idaho's on a roll. Even Elon Musk posted on social media 3 times in one day about Idaho's red tape reduction successes. We know we have caught the attention of the rest of the country. President Trump's new Department of Government Efficiency is already looking to Idaho for the blueprint on how to cut red tape, stimulate economic growth, and streamline government. Idaho stands ready to partner with the Trump administration because, let's face it, Idaho was Doge before Doge was cool. As the least regulated state in the country, Idaho has an incredible story to share, one worth replicating elsewhere, including Washington, D.C. In the coming weeks, I will highlight all the ways Idaho is conquering waste in government and some brand new ideas on reducing government's footprints in people's lives. In the spirit of efficiency, I assure you this speech will be one of the shortest State of the State addresses in a long time. You're welcome. As the new administration takes place over the next few weeks, we will know more and we will see a more secure border is imminent. As President Trump and Congress deliver on their own promises to lock down the border, Idaho stands ready to help deport dangerous criminals here illegally. The Idaho State Police just wrapped up their 4th mission to the border. They intercepted deadly drugs and apprehended criminals coming across the open border under the Biden administration. No other state has completed more missions to border states than Idaho. As we have done before, our troopers return with new knowledge and will train other law enforcement agencies on the drug cartel's latest tactics. We have some of those troopers here with us today. Thank you for your dedicated service. Please stand. Meanwhile, Idaho is taking even more steps to keep our communities safe. Working with local law enforcement partners, we've reduced crime in Idaho by 17% since I took office, despite record population growth. Violent crime is at a 5-year low, and we're among the top 10 safest states, but there's more we can do. My Keeping Promises plan includes the addition of a new prosecutor in North Idaho who will solely focus on putting away drug traffickers. Unlike drug-friendly states, including our neighboring Oregon, we are sending a clear message to nefarious criminals that the only place they're welcome in Idaho is behind bars. We will also see the benefits of our meaningful investments in corrections. We're demonstrating we can be tough on crime while ensuring those who want to be productive members of society, they have an off-ramp to a better life. When it comes to the safety of Americans, China and Russia are working around the clock to inflict harm through cyber threats. We routinely beat back foreign hackers to protect Idahoans' data, and the leading experts of the Idaho National Lab continue to fight against such bad actors. But we will do even more to protect citizens online. My Keeping Promises plan reinforces our state's defenses against China and Russia by adding more resources to cybersecurity. My friends, I am excited to hit the ground running and pick up where we left off with President Trump. We stand ready to hold up Idaho as an shining example of how to properly and minimally govern, which starts and ends with keeping promises to the people we serve. As we prepare to celebrate the 250th birthday of our great country, we reflect on what it means to be American. Our past, our future is rooted in freedom, self-reliance, while taking care of each other with a constant faith in God. To the people of Idaho, as your elected leaders, we promise to continue governing responsibly and to uphold freedom and common sense in our decisions. Like we've done time and time again, we will deliver on that promise. Thank you, and God bless.
You can't go very far. We're going to talk about that.
We just heard Governor Brad Little's State of the State address kicking off the 2025 legislative session. Joining me to break down the highlights of Governor Little's policy priorities are Director Lori Wolf of the Division of Financial Management, Kevin Richert of Idaho Education News, and Dr. Stephanie Witt of Boise State University's School of Public Service. Lori, what is the governor's request, the total request, and how does it compare to previous years?
So year-over-year expenditures, it's about a 4.5% increase. Obviously, you heard today he's investing in his priorities in education, in infrastructure, transportation. He's focused on public safety, but he's also prepared to issue tax relief. And in his budget, he's also transferring, actually it'll be record reserve funds in our rainy day accounts, up to $1.4 billion in reserve.
To clarify, that's transferring budget money that we have this year in the 2026 budget to the rainy day funds for future use. And we heard those highlights, and as usual, education is at the top of the governor's priority list with $150 million in public school funding, including $50 million for rural school facilities, mental health, and school safety. What might those investments look like?
Yeah, so you heard the governor today. He is doubling down on education. He's actually delivered, since he took office, 80% increase in investments in education. You heard him talk about that today. This year, with that additional $50 million, he knows that we still have needs in rural school facilities. We took a big chunk out of facilities last year. A lot of progress there. Schools are receiving their money. It's a little tougher in rural schools because of their attendance. They have less students, so they get less money. But a roof is about the same cost regardless of how many students you have. So we know we need to right-size that, and the governor's committed to that. We've also had calls for mental health services over and over again, looking for a bill that can help support schools in that area. And then you heard him talk about accountability, not only in school choice, but also in public schools. And he wants to see literacy and learning across the board. And that's where he wants to see investments and improvements, both in public schools and any choice opportunities that we give students.
Dr. Witt, we've talked about this so many times, but when we're talking about rural schools, you don't only have the attendance units that help fund on the state level, but also the local property taxpayers. There are fewer of them, and property values vary from district to district. That really plays into how these rural school districts are able to fund facilities.
Well, prior to the governor's recently adopted plan last year to add state money for facilities, the 100% of the cost of school buildings and remodel, that kind of thing, fell to local taxpayers. So when you have fewer landowners and a potential that your whole of your property tax value is not going to generate very much, it's difficult to keep up. There's a marginal cost to having a school building, regardless of how many kids are inside it, right? So it's a tough one for rural districts to come up with that kind of tax revenue.
I mean, it's always been an issue of tax bases in school districts. West Ada or Boise can tax for facilities across a much wider swath of property. You go into a school district like Soda Springs, which had a bond issue failed in November, it's a lot tougher because there just aren't as many property taxpayers to go around.
Absolutely.
Dr. Witt mentioned the bill from last year that would help fund some of these deferred maintenance needs for rural school facilities. Where are we on that now?
Well, what we've seen the money starting to roll out. We've seen, I believe right now, probably most, if not all of the school districts have submitted their 10-year plans explaining what they feel like they need in terms of facility needs. But I think what you heard here today is a little bit of, we put all this money in, now we need to make sure that it's working across the board, and is it working properly for the small districts as well as the larger districts.
And Melissa, I think just to add on to that, I think that's what the governor recognized in this budget. Schools are starting to get that funding, and I remember last year Kevin talked about salmon. Actually grew up there, so have knowledge of that cafeteria. But it's a good example of a rural district that did get funding through this modernization bill. They did actually finally pass a bond. They're still short. They're still short funding. And those rural schools just have a harder time, even if they can pass a bond, to get some of these facilities figured out. And that's why he's prioritizing a look at rural schools this year.
And to remind viewers of what we talked about last year with the Salmon School District, we were talking about a facility that was in such rough shape. It had a leaky roof, and I can't remember the list of maintenance issues that the school had, but it didn't sound like a safe place to be teaching students.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, and I think, public schools, they have to have a safe and good learning environment for them to get outcomes, and that's why there's more funding going toward that.
But there's an equity issue here too, right? Like, there are districts in the state where the patrons have voted to have bonds and take on that additional tax load. There are other districts where those have not succeeded, right? So what is the fair thing to do? Are we rewarding districts who couldn't get their patrons to vote yes at the astronomically high approval threshold we have? or are we divvying up the money that we have now in a more fair way?
And the governor made some interesting comments about this on Friday during the legislative preview. He talked about the facilities program, and he said, we want to make it fair. We want to make it fair for rural districts, but we don't want to make it so fair that the districts are in a position where they don't have to do find some efficiencies and find some cost savings within their own budgets.
And it's a 2/3 majority to pass these, which is a high threshold for a lot of these districts. But how much does fairness play into it when there is a state constitution mandate for equitable public education? Do you punish those students because the taxpayers, the voting citizens of that district, some of whom don't have kids in the public schools, vote no?
Well, just because I don't have a kid in the district doesn't mean I don't benefit from the schools, right? I need the people who are going to fix my car, do my taxes, teach the generations to come. All the workforce need to know what they're doing. We all need educated Idahoans. And so just because I don't have a kid in school doesn't mean that I shouldn't have to pay for the school system.
The governor also recommended a 5% pay raise for all state employees, including teachers, classified staff, and administrators, as well as $28 million to ensure teachers remain at the state level of funding for the insurance plan. Kevin, teacher retention has long been an issue in Idaho. The state has really tackled it in the last few years, trying to get those levels up to at least our neighboring states in the cost of living.
And it feels like what we're entering into right now is a new chapter in the process of trying to increase teacher pay. I mean, we're out of this era of the Career Ladder program, which was established 10 years ago. Dating myself right now. 10 years ago, this was passed by the legislature. Now we're tying it. Now it's part of the CEC, and that's 5% CEC is. I'd have to go back and look. That's a fairly robust CEC across the board for all state employees. And I know, inflation probably driving that 5% request. It'll be interesting to see how the legislature views that for all state employees, but now for teachers and school administrators as well, because they're part of that equation.
CEC, of course, means change in employee compensation, so basically a pay raise, right? Is the governor worried about the legislature buying into this 5% pay increase for state employees?
Well, I think we've heard for years, and the CEC committee is going to hear this year from Division of Human Resources about the retention and recruitment challenges that we continue to have. But, putting this in the budget, it shows his commitment to teachers. It's about $83 million in teacher pay increases, shows his commitment to state employees. And if we're going to operate efficiently and effective government, we have to have good employees, and we need to keep them.
There is also $50 million set aside to support public money going to private school expenses, as long as it's, quote, fair, responsible, transparent, and accountable. The governor said he'll only consider a school choice proposal that meets the same standards while prioritizing the families that need it the most. Kevin, to me, it sounds like he has his veto stamp ready for any school choice or a tax credit or voucher proposal that doesn't meet those criteria.
It does give him a lot of leeway to say this does not meet the guidelines that I set out at the beginning of the session. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of proposal gets through the legislature, assuming that one does, and how is that viewed by the governor if it reaches his desk. So there's a lot there, and I'm surprised in the sense that on Friday when he met with reporters, the governor was very non-committal about anything regarding private school choice. He's been pretty non-committal about this for the first 6 years he's been in office. So this $50 million set aside in the budget is a bit of a surprise.
Not just non-committal, but saying, as he repeated in today's speech, that Idaho already has great school choice.
We have a lot of school choice. I mean, he repeated that message again. And an interesting phrase in this speech, there wasn't a lot to spare in this speech because it's only a 22-minute speech. He went out of his way to say that he wants to ensure that the best choice for children is still the public school. I don't think that was a throwaway line. I think that was perhaps a message to legislators to say, okay, I'm willing to look at this. I put some money aside. I don't think we need it as a panacea to address any and all issues that legislators may have with education in Idaho.
And I think that's absolutely what the governor was doing with this budget proposal. He cares about public schools, but as he said, he cares about education options and he cares about outcomes. And what he wants to see are students being able to be successful and have successful outcomes. He recognized that there are some with, physical or developmental challenges that aren't able to be successful in public schools, and that's why he's open to options. But again, I think he's doubling down, saying, public schools should be the place where our kids can get the best education.
This is his 7th state of the state. Can you give us some insight into why this is the year?
Well, I think you've seen this from parents, and we saw it in the election results. It was a resounding, topic that individuals were talking about. And we've had legislators who have tried tackling some of the challenges in public education for several years. I think they see this as a path to offer some of those options for some of the students that maybe aren't as successful in public schools, and wants to make sure that they too have a pathway to graduating and career.
And no surprise to anyone who has been paying attention to the conversation leading up to this session, there's already a proposal ready for the legislature to hear. This morning, Representative Wendy Horman unveiled her pitch for a tax credit for private school expenses that families might incur.
We will again be bringing a bill very similar to the one we ran last year, which was a refundable tax credit. That bill we will bring forward as soon as possible in this session. It allows a parent to receive a refundable tax credit for educational experiences they have incurred up to $5,000 per child, $7,500 if their child has special needs in a non-public setting, whether that is a private school, a micro school, a learning pod, or a homeschool. Available to all of those options. An eligible student will be an Idaho resident, 5 to 18, unless you're special needs, then it'll be 5 to 21. Qualified expenses are what you would expect. Tuition at a non-public school, including micro schools and learning pods, tutoring, national college admission tests, AP exams, prep courses, textbook, curriculum, and transportation costs this year.
The proposal gives priority to students whose families are below 300% of the poverty level. Private schools must teach certain curriculum to be eligible, including English language, math, science, and social studies. The bill is capped at $50 million. It can only change if a future legislature determines that it can. And Representative Horman says it doesn't take away from the public school budget. Kevin, do we know enough about this proposal yet to say if it meets Governor Little's criteria?
Well, that's going to be the $50 million question here, because the figures line up. I mean, they're both talking about a $50 million line item here for private school choice, but you start to talk about language of making sure that this is fair, responsible, transparent, and accountable. That leaves a lot of room for interpretation and debate. This is going to be the debate of the session, I think.
Right. Whose definition of transparent and fair and accountable are we using? Because when I look at transparency, I know that I have a very different definition than, maybe some public officials.
Yeah. Which definition or definitions win the day here over the next 3 months is going to determine what passes, or if anything passes at all.
Do we know if this accountability measure would be part of the existing State Board of Education, Department of Education? I mean, we already have a lot of infrastructure to ensure accountability about education. Would this be taped on to the outside of that, or exempt, or does anyone know?
And would private education groups support that? Would they want to go down that road and accept that kind of level of accountability for this kind of state funding support? A lot to play out here in the next 3 months.
So many stakeholders, not just educators, but also homeschool families and families who already have students in private school. And also, this proposal doesn't mean that there won't be competing private school funding bills that go in front of the legislature.
We've heard rumblings that there are multiple bills in the hopper. I have to believe that we'll see a variety of proposals before this session winds out.
Before we move on from education, I do have to mention Launch. The governor touted his success in this program that he introduced 2 years ago. This has been a highlight of his second term.
Absolutely. And we're really excited to see some of the outcomes. I think, when we go back to what problem were we trying to solve when we put launch in place, we're doing exactly what we wanted it to do, and that's increasing go-on rates, that's getting our kids trained, and for economic development and economic growth, we have to have people ready to fill those jobs. And this is a pipeline, and it's important. And as you heard from the governor, he's investing an additional $25 million to go toward these programs, not toward launch grants, but toward the programs to help build them out, get more seats. The demand is out there. I know in one school they can train about 64 nurses. They have about 160 on a wait list, so more people wanting to go through. We all know we have a nursing shortage. Again, it's that economic development, economic support that this program gives. We're excited to see it's working.
It's like a bottleneck, though. So many students who, we've been talking about the go-on rate for so long now, and I know that when Governor Little was lieutenant governor, that was high on his priority list, trying to help get that go-on rate up. But making sure that there are spots for those students to go is a different conversation as well.
It's another case where how you define things is going to determine which narrative wins out this session. I mean, the governor today defined the success of the launch program in terms of the college enrollment numbers we saw this fall, about how 2/3 of the students who went to school this fall are using launch dollars, the increase in community colleges, in community college enrollment. When House Speaker Mike Moyle talked about launch on Friday at the legislative preview, he kind of made it clear that he's looking for something other than a program that's routing a lot of students or a vast majority of students into college. He wants to see more of an emphasis on short-term job training, 1 or 2 year programs, not necessarily increases in 4-year enrollment or even 2-year enrollment. So it'll be interesting to see where the legislature comes down and what launch looks like at the end of the session.
And the flip side of that, of course, is you need to go on to 2 or 4 year higher education in order to be a nurse or a medical professional. That's one of our major needs as a state.
And I think our economy drives some of this, right? What jobs do we need with the growth that we're seeing? And it's across the board. I mean, we do need, there's everything from welders to electricians to plumbers to linemen, but there's also, we have shortages in some of those healthcare programs and engineers. And we have to be able to have pipelines to all of those jobs if we're going to continue with this growth.
The governor also mentioned setting aside $100 million for tax relief, whatever that might look like. Director, can you tell us if he has a preference?
So the governor loves tax relief. You see that in his record, $4.6 billion since he took office. This will add another $100 million. He's willing to have the conversations. I think he wants to do what's best for Idaho families and what their priorities are, and he's willing to work with the legislature, setting this money aside for tax relief and put it back in a meaningful way in the wallets of Idahoans.
There have been lawmakers on both sides of the aisle and along the whole spectrum of Republican lawmakers, because of course no two Republicans think alike, as we know. Lots of conversation about getting rid of the grocery tax in Idaho. Governor Little has long been a skeptic of that. Is that something that he would consider?
Well, I think the governor said he'll sign a tax bill if it gets to his desk. He is going to want to make sure it fits within the budget. And he's willing to talk to his legislative partners. When you ask him grocery, he'll say yes. When he says income tax, he'll say yes. Property tax, yes. He even did some stuff with the child tax credit, so he's open.
That's kind of a surprise to me because, again, he's long been a skeptic of that grocery tax.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure we should look forward to it passing the legislature, and he may not have to make a decision about this. This has been a long time no-go issue for Speaker Moyle. We'll see. Maybe something has changed, but in terms of the gas or the grocery tax, I would be surprised if they get a reduction or an elimination through.
And I think there's been a lot. Sorry.
No.
A lot of conversation about the tax credit, the grocery tax credit, and the value of what that does, and whether or not getting rid of that credit really is going to give any more benefit than what we're already getting in the credit, or if we need to increase the credit. But there's a lot of people who pay that grocery tax, including out-of-staters, tourists, And
Which we have more and more of.
exactly.
Right.
Governor Little's been at this for a while. I mean, this is his 7th rodeo here, and I think that's really evident in a lot of what we heard in this State of the State. He's open to options, open to discussion on what tax relief looks like. He's open to discussion about what form a private school funding looks like, whether it's an ESA, an education savings account, or a tax credit, or something else. He's flexible on where that $50 million in education goes. Does it go to rural facilities? Does it go into literacy? There's a lot of room to negotiate, and I think that's deliberate on the governor's part. He knows that he's got to negotiate with the legislature, even though it's an overwhelmingly Republican legislature. If he wants these initiatives to go through, he's got to have some give or take with the third floor. So pretty clear that he was sending that message this afternoon.
And Director, you mentioned that if this were to pass at $100 million, that would bring the total since Governor Little took office to $4.7 billion in tax cuts. And I know that some have argued that that's a lot of money that could have gone toward things like deferred maintenance or infrastructure. What's the calculus on investment needs that the state has, especially as our population grows, versus putting money directly back into people's pockets?
And that's the fun part about putting a budget together, because you have to balance, right? And you saw in this budget already today some of the critical investments and things that we haven't put money toward before, like ongoing funding toward water, ongoing funding toward fire, more money to education, more money to launch. He is prioritizing the things that matter to Idaho families, and once he does that, he's not going to keep spending. He's going to give some back, and that's the beauty of this conservative and I think balanced budget and balanced approach.
Let's talk a little bit about that infrastructure investment that is in the governor's proposal. $30 million for water infrastructure, especially for recharging the Eastern Snake Plain Aquifer. Is this $30 million in new funding?
It is. It's $30 million in new funding. We've put a lot of one-time funding through our ARPA and some of our surplus plus funds toward projects, but what we do know is there's a couple $100 million in projects still on the list. And we say all the time, it's what we do in the good times that matter for when the bad times come. And having this ongoing funding in water helps accomplish exactly what the farmers and stakeholders did in getting this plan together. It's going to help us execute it.
And to state the obvious, water is so important for Idaho's economy, especially in the ag sector. But it's also really important when we're talking about population growth.
Yeah, we're focused today on the agricultural sector and its impact on water's impact on agriculture. But of course, the big users of water that may edge out agriculture in the years in the future would be our growing cities, who are drawing from the same aquifers in many cases that farmers are. And so they are often junior to the agricultural users in water rights, and so that's going to be a pressing issue further down the road. Maybe not today.
Any idea how the incoming Trump administration, Part 2, might play into discussions about water supply and demand over state lines? Because, of course, the river doesn't stop flowing at the Idaho-Oregon border.
Yeah, I would assume that the salmon issue would be back up on the agenda in a different way than it has been under the Biden administration, where we saw some support for removal of the lower Snake River dams. I'm not certain that's going to extend into the new Trump administration at all. And of course, outside of Idaho, the major western regional water issue is the Colorado River Basin, and there's been a multiple decade-long set of agreements to try to figure out how to keep that system alive and thriving. So my guess is that any progress in terms of conservation may evaporate, if I can use a water metaphor there, under the Trump administration.
I caught it, and I appreciate
Thank
it.
you.
It was
I'm
very,
here
very
to help.
good.
Yeah.
There are also recommendations for transportation in this budget, including $50 million for bonding authority for transportation expansion and congestion mitigation, adding to the $80 million in bonding authority that we already have annually. Is that going to be enough?
Well, as fast as this state is growing, we cannot ignore transportation. And ITD will issue their last bond sale this spring, so the time is now for this funding if we're going to keep up with growth. We have between $8 and $10 billion in expansion projects across the state, and we have to keep going. We have all driven the highways of some of those fast-growing states, and we're fortunate, but again, it's like water. We have to do something now, or we're going to regret it in 5-10 years from now.
There were so many other parts of Governor Little's budget proposal. I do want to get to child welfare. $9.6 million recommended to support, quote, prevention and transformation efforts in Idaho's foster care system. This comes after IDHW Director Alex Adams has made the reformation of the foster care system the highest priority. In his, I think, 7-8 months in that position so far. How does Governor Little's recommendation compare to what IDHW has requested for foster care?
So Governor Little fully supports Director Adams and his work that he's doing in foster care reform. He's doing an incredible job. He has a great plan. Between the time that the request was submitted and the time we got the recommendation done, we worked with Director Adams on some adjustments that he wanted. He's going to go into some details of that when he presents that budget, but you'll find that the funding is about the same, maybe a little bit more. There is a little bit difference in the FTE, but it does not take away from the trajectory and the priorities of what he's doing in foster care reform.
And an FTE is a full-time employee,
yes.
right?
Yes.
An actual funding for a physical body in that office.
Right.
Right. While we're on the subject of the Department of Health and Welfare, we didn't hear anything in Governor Little's speech about Medicaid, either Medicaid expansion or cutting existing programs to cut costs, which have that's been such a concern for lawmakers over the years, whether it is getting costs down or preserving the programs that Idaho has, and in some cases expanding them to meet the needs of Idahoans. Where is Governor Little on this?
So Director Adams' budget was fully recommended with his Medicaid request this year. It's a maintenance budget. He did not ask for new programs or additional programs. What you'll see are some increases because of our FMAP rate and because of some rate changes. But overall, I know Director Adams has a lot of experience putting budgets together, and Medicaid's always the one that can run away from you really quickly if you're not careful. And I know he has his eye on making sure that we can contain those costs and limit growth while also making sure people have access to health care.
Can you give us any insight as to whether either Director Adams or Governor Little are taking a step back and waiting to see how the second Trump administration approaches Medicaid?
Well, I think we'll see a lot of changes at the administration level. I know when Trump was in office before, they were a lot more open to waivers and changes and flexibility in states in order to contain those costs. We're looking forward to working with the administration, and I know Director Adams has a list of things he would like to work with them on.
The governor also requested $850,000 for additional medical residency positions and $500,000 for the rural physician incentive program. These recommendations come as Idaho continues to struggle with a physician shortage, especially acute in rural areas. We've been talking about this for years, Dr. Witt.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure the hope here is to try to decrease the backlog that we have in the number of physicians that we need in Idaho. Our physician to population ratio is not good, and I think there are some challenges to this, not only economic, like salary issues, but also we're seeing some resistance among physicians to relocate to Idaho relative to the abortion legislation and practicing in a state with that particular set of laws. So I think there are some big questions there. And does the Idaho State University potential takeover of the medical school come into this at all?
That is not part of this budget.
Okay.
It's not been additional conversations, but the $850,000 does fund an additional about 18 slots for residencies. And then the rural incentive program, the governor is actually recommending that that's ongoing funding so that there's some consistency in being able to incentivize those physicians to locate in rural areas.
And all of it does come at a time where there is a lot of discussion about medical education in Idaho. Dr. Witt referenced Idaho State's interest in the feasibility of acquiring the Idaho College of Osteopathic Medicine. It's a pretty preliminary discussion at this point, but it'll be interesting to see if this legislature looks at trying to buy more seats in medical schools across the region, whether it's University of Washington, University of Utah, or Icahn.
The governor also requested $37 million in additional funds for the state public defender's office. How does that match what the state public defender's office requested?
So the governor has fully recommended what the public defense office has requested. They did have one request back in September, and that was before the consolidation happened.
Right,
so
that
they
new
knew less.
office started
Yes.
in October, right?
Yes, on October 1st. Since then, obviously, we've seen some challenges and maybe some unknown barriers in being able to get that consolidated. So in December, State Public Defense came back and requested additional funding, and that has been fully recommended in this budget.
And of course, this all comes after the ACLU filed an emergency motion with the Idaho Supreme Court in late December, asking them to intervene in the state's new statewide public defense system and release any defendant who hasn't yet been able to speak to their public defender. We have a story on that at idahoreports.org, and we'll have more on this Friday's show. Dr. Witt, was there anything that we didn't hear that you were listening for?
Well, we touched on several. The corrections is a giant slice of the budget. It was mentioned in passing, but no particular priorities listed there. Of course, Medicaid, you mentioned. And we talked about tax relief, but not property taxes in particular. And so I think as Idahoans continue to live with the rapid rise in our assessed values of our homes, that there may still be some people who'd like to see a little attention to that property tax.
Kevin, we have less than a minute left. What are you going to be watching for in coming weeks?
Well, I'm going to be interested to see the negotiations that we see unfold eventually publicly over what a private school choice bill might look like, what a tax bill might look like, what some of these education funding issues might look like. Pretty short speech today. I mean, he did keep one promise that he made to the state leaders. It was going to be a short speech. Whether that translates into a short legislative session, I'm hopeful, but not wildly optimistic.
Also want to note that we didn't hear a whole lot about higher education except for women's volleyball and the Heisman Trophy.
Standing ovation.
Standing ovation for the BSU women's volleyball team. Thank you all three for joining us today, and thank you for watching. We'll have much more on the first week of the legislative session on this week's Idaho Reports, and we'll have more online at idahoreports.org.
Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television is made possible through the generous support of the Laura Moore Cunningham Foundation, committed to fulfilling the Moore and Bettis family legacy of building the great state of Idaho, by the Friends of Idaho Public Television, and by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. Presentation of Idaho Reports on Idaho Public Television